If you have been waking up more tired than when you went to bed, if your vision sometimes goes slightly blurry in the afternoon for no reason you can explain, if your feet tingle at night or your wounds seem to heal more slowly than they used to, I need you to stay with me through this video. Because what I am about to show you is not about dramatic symptoms. It is not about fainting or rushing to an emergency room. It is about the quieter signals, the ones your body sends weeks, months, and sometimes years before the damage becomes obvious. I am Dr. Alex, and today we are going to talk about 10 silent signs that blood sugar may be harming your body right now, while life continues as normal around you, while you are sleeping, eating, going for walks, and telling yourself you probably feel fine. The reason I use the word silent is deliberate, because most people imagine that high blood sugar feels like something. They imagine dizziness, shaking, dramatic thirst, the kind of symptoms you cannot possibly miss. And those do exist, but they are usually not the beginning. The beginning is quieter, and that silence is exactly what makes the damage so dangerous. Because if you do not recognize the early signals, the body keeps sending them while the harm keeps building. And by the time the signal gets loud enough to stop your day, the consequences are often much harder to reverse than they would have been if caught earlier. So let me take you through these 10 signs carefully, not to frighten you, but because clarity is protection, and understanding what your body is actually saying is the most powerful thing you can do before a number on a lab report forces the conversation anyway. The first sign is waking up tired no matter how long you sleep. Patricia was 64 and proud of her discipline around sleep. She kept a regular schedule, had blackout curtains, went to bed at the same time every night, and still woke up each morning feeling like she had run a marathon in her dreams. She described it to her daughter as bone tired, not sleepy, tired in a way that 8 hours did not touch. She blamed her age, she blamed the weather, she blamed stress, and then she blamed her mattress and bought a new one. But the real story was happening inside her cells every single night. When blood sugar stays elevated over time, the body cannot efficiently convert glucose into energy. The cells are surrounded by fuel they cannot properly use, so the body runs inefficiently, like an engine with dirty fuel lines. The machinery keeps turning, but the output is poor. You wake up depleted because your body has been working harder than it should all night to manage what the glucose levels demanded. And here is what makes this so easy to miss. The fatigue from chronic blood sugar elevation does not feel like the fatigue from illness. There is no fever, no obvious infection, no dramatic reason. It just feels like you are aging faster than you should. It feels like mornings have become harder for no explainable cause. And because the explanation is invisible, most people adapt to it. They drink an extra cup of coffee. They push through. They tell themselves this is just what getting older feels like. But it is not always age. Sometimes it is a metabolic signal. And it is worth asking the question instead of accepting the exhaustion as inevitable. The second sign is blurry vision that comes and goes. Most people think of vision problems as something that builds slowly over years, and many do. But blood sugar fluctuations can change your vision within hours. Thomas was 71, had worn reading glasses for years, and assumed the blurriness he noticed in the afternoons was just his eyes getting worse with age. He went to his optometrist twice in 1 year. His prescription was adjusted once. The blurriness continued. What Thomas did not realize, and what his optometrist had not connected yet, is that the lens inside the eye is directly affected by glucose levels in the blood. When blood sugar rises, the lens absorbs fluid and actually changes shape slightly. That shift affects how light focuses on the retina. So your vision becomes less sharp, sometimes blurry or wavy, sometimes worse for near, sometimes worse for far, depending on the fluctuation. The critical word here is comes and goes, because this is not the slow, steady decline of cataracts or macular degeneration. It moves with your glucose, better after fasting, sometimes worse after a large meal. That pattern, that rhythm, is a diagnostic clue, and most people miss it because they are not tracking it. Over time, if blood sugar elevation continues, the damage becomes structural. The small blood vessels inside the retina begin to weaken. This is called diabetic retinopathy, and it is the leading cause of blindness in adults over 50. But it does not begin with blindness. It begins with blurry afternoons that people attribute to their glasses prescription being slightly off. If your vision varies through the day and no lens correction has fully solved it, that deserves a conversation with your doctor that goes beyond optometry. The third sign is tingling, numbness, or a burning sensation in the feet or hands. This is one of the most reported early warning signs, and also one of the most consistently dismissed. People describe it as pins and needles when they wake up, a burning at the bottom of the feet in the evening, or a sensation that the foot has fallen asleep, even when it has not been in a position to do so. Margaret was 67 and had been telling herself for over a year that the tingling in her feet was probably circulation. She elevated her legs before bed. She bought compression socks from the pharmacy. The tingling continued. Some nights it was mild. Some nights it kept her awake because the burning felt like her feet were resting on a mild heat source that nobody else could feel. What was actually happening is a process called peripheral neuropathy. When blood sugar remains elevated over months and years, the glucose damages the small blood vessels that supply the nerves in the extremities. The nerves begin to lose their insulation, a material called myelin. When that insulation is compromised, the nerve signals become distorted. The brain receives mixed messages from the feet and hands. It interprets those distorted signals as tingling, burning, numbness, or sometimes a strange sensitivity where even the weight of a bedsheet feels uncomfortable. And here is what makes this particularly serious. Once nerve damage accumulates, it does not always reverse. The tingling that feels like a nuisance today can progress to permanent numbness tomorrow. And numbness in the feet is dangerous because it removes the body's warning system for injury. Cuts, blisters, and pressure sores go unfelt. And in a foot with poor blood circulation from the same underlying blood sugar problem, small wounds that go unnoticed can become infected and serious very quickly. This is not meant to alarm, but if you have tingling or burning in your feet or hands that is new or worsening, please do not dismiss it as just poor circulation. It deserves a proper evaluation of what is driving it. The fourth sign is wounds or cuts that take longer to heal than they used to. This one tends to sneak up on people gradually. You nick your finger and notice it seems to take longer than usual to close. A scrape on the shin from the garden takes 2 weeks to fully resolve. A small blister from new shoes becomes irritated and lingers for a month. Raymond was 73 and assumed his slow healing was just normal aging. And it is true that healing slows somewhat as we get older. But what was happening in Raymond's case was not age, it was glucose. When blood sugar is chronically elevated, it impairs the function of white blood cells, which are the body's primary infection fighters. It thickens the blood and slows circulation to small vessels. It damages the inner lining of blood vessels so nutrients and oxygen cannot reach wounded tissue as efficiently. And it impairs collagen production, which is the structural protein the body uses to knit skin back together. The result is wounds that linger, small infections that take hold more easily than they should, healing that happens in slow motion. And the real danger is not the inconvenience. The danger is that chronic wounds become entry points for serious bacterial infections, particularly in the feet and lower legs where circulation is already reduced. Hospitals see the consequences of this every day. But those consequences began with small wounds that nobody thought were worth mentioning because, well, we all get small wounds. If you have noticed your healing has slowed over the past year or two, it is worth treating that as information rather than assumption. The fifth sign is getting infections more often, particularly yeast infections, urinary tract infections, or skin infections. The immune system requires a stable internal environment to function at its best. When blood sugar is elevated, that environment is disrupted in several important ways. High glucose levels suppress the activity of neutrophils, which are the immune cells that arrive first at a site of infection. It creates a glucose-rich environment in the tissues and mucous membranes, where bacteria and yeast thrive and multiply more easily. And it slows the inflammatory response that normally resolves minor infections quickly. Diana was 69 and had dealt with 3 yeast infections in 1 calendar year. She treated each one with an over-the-counter antifungal like Monistat from CVS or Walgreens, recovered, and did not think much about the pattern until the 4th one arrived. Her gynecologist was the first to say, "We should check your blood sugar." And that conversation changed the trajectory of Diana's health, because yeast, particularly Candida, feeds directly on glucose. When glucose levels in the blood are elevated, the tissues and secretions of the body also carry more glucose. That creates a feeding environment that makes Candida grow more aggressively and makes treatment less durable. The infection resolves, but without addressing the glucose, the conditions that encouraged it remain. The same principle applies to urinary tract infections. Elevated blood sugar changes the chemistry of the urinary tract, making it more hospitable to bacteria like E. coli, and to skin infections, where bacteria colonize glucose-rich skin tissue and abscesses form more easily. If you are someone who gets recurrent infections of any kind and the pattern has become more frequent in recent years, please bring the full picture to your doctor. Recurring infections are not just bad luck. They are sometimes the body asking a question about blood sugar that nobody has thought to ask yet. The 6th sign is feeling intense hunger or cravings shortly after eating a full meal. This one confuses people because the logic seems backward. You just ate. Why would your body be demanding food again? The answer lies in something called insulin resistance, which is one of the central problems in blood sugar dysregulation. Here is how it works. When you eat, blood sugar rises and the pancreas releases insulin to help cells absorb that glucose for energy. But when cells have become resistant to insulin's signal, the glucose cannot enter efficiently. It stays elevated in the bloodstream. The cells, meanwhile, are not receiving the energy they expected. So they send hunger signals back to the brain. The brain hears, "We are hungry," even though the blood carries more glucose than it should. Frank was 70 and had started noticing that an hour after dinner, he craved something sweet intensely. He had never been a dessert person. He had eaten sensibly for most of his life. And now he found himself standing in front of the kitchen cupboard an hour after a full meal, almost irresistibly drawn to carbohydrates. He thought his appetite was changing because of age or habit. But what was changing was his cell-level response to insulin. The craving was not a character flaw, it was a metabolic signal. And insulin resistance is not just the precursor to type 2 diabetes. It is the condition that allows blood sugar to do damage for years before any formal diagnosis is made. If you have noticed you feel hungry again soon after eating, or that you experience strong carbohydrate cravings in the hour or 2 after meals, please take that seriously as clinical information rather than a willpower problem. The 7th sign is increased urination, particularly at night. Most people know that frequent urination is associated with diabetes, but they imagine it as something obvious and dramatic. What actually happens in the early stages is subtler. You start waking up once at night where you rarely did before, then twice. You notice you are visiting the bathroom more often during the day without having changed how much you are drinking. When blood sugar is elevated, the kidneys work overtime to filter and excrete the excess glucose through urine, but glucose pulls water with it, a process called osmotic diuresis. So the body produces more urine than usual. And because the kidneys cannot always keep up with filtering at night while the rest of the body slows down, the bladder fills more quickly. Eleanor was 66 and assumed her nighttime bathroom trips were a normal consequence of getting older. She had heard that bladder control diminishes with age. She started limiting her water intake in the evening to reduce the trips. But the trips continued, even with less fluid, because the driving force was not excess hydration. It was excess glucose pulling water through the kidneys continuously. What made Eleanor's situation more complicated is that limiting fluids while glucose is driving diuresis can actually concentrate the blood and create a cycle of dehydration that makes other symptoms, including fatigue and dizziness, significantly worse. If your bathroom visits at night have increased and you cannot attribute it to simply drinking more fluids, this is a sign that deserves proper evaluation rather than adjustment to your evening drinking schedule. The eighth sign is skin changes, including darkened patches, unusual dryness, or slow-healing skin tags. The skin is one of the body's most visible organs, and it reflects internal metabolic changes in ways that are surprisingly specific if you know what to look for. One of the most telling changes is the appearance of darkened, velvety patches of skin in the folds of the body, the back of the neck, the armpits, the groin, the elbows. This condition is called acanthosis nigricans, and it is directly linked to elevated insulin levels. When the body produces excess insulin to try to overcome insulin resistance, the skin cells in these areas respond by thickening and darkening. Many people notice it and think it is a hygiene issue or a skin condition unrelated to their internal health. It is not. It is a metabolic marker, and it often precedes a formal blood sugar diagnosis by years. Beyond acanthosis nigricans, the skin also becomes drier and more prone to cracking when blood sugar is elevated. Glucose-driven dehydration affects the skin's moisture barrier. The feet and lower legs are often the first areas where this cracking becomes significant. People reach for Eucerin or CeraVe moisturizing cream from the pharmacy and manage the surface symptom without realizing the internal cause. Skin tags, the small flesh-colored growths that appear in skin folds, also appear more frequently in people with elevated insulin. They are benign, but their clustering in someone who has not had them before can be a quiet indicator of metabolic change. If you have noticed new darkening in the folds of your skin, increasing skin dryness that does not respond well to moisturizer, or a sudden proliferation of skin tags, please mention this to your doctor specifically. It is easy to overlook in a routine visit, but clinically meaningful when connected to the broader picture. The ninth sign is brain fog, poor memory, and difficulty concentrating. This may be the most underestimated sign on this list because it is so easy to attribute to stress, aging, poor sleep, or simply having too much on your mind. But chronic blood sugar elevation has measurable effects on the brain that are independent of all of those explanations. The brain is the most glucose-dependent organ in the body, consuming approximately 20% of all the body's energy. When insulin resistance affects how efficiently cells use glucose, the brain is not immune to that inefficiency. Studies using brain imaging have shown that insulin-resistant individuals show reduced glucose metabolism in the regions responsible for memory and executive function, the same regions that are affected early in Alzheimer's disease. Arthur was 72 and had become increasingly frustrated with himself for losing words mid-sentence. He had always been sharp, articulate, a voracious reader. Now he would be in the middle of explaining something to his wife and the word he wanted would simply vanish. He blamed stress. He blamed the news. He made jokes about senior moments that secretly worried him. But Arthur had also gained about 12 pounds over the previous 2 years, was waking up tired most mornings, and craving sweets after dinner. When those pieces were assembled together, they told a story that brain fog alone could not tell. The connection between blood sugar dysregulation and cognitive decline is an area of active and urgent research. Some researchers have begun calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes in recognition of the insulin resistance pathways involved. That is still a matter of scientific debate. But what is not debated is that sustained high blood sugar damages small blood vessels throughout the body, including those that supply the brain. And that damage accumulates quietly over years before it announces itself. If your thinking has felt slower than it used to, if you lose words, misplace things more frequently, or find concentration harder than it once was, please do not simply file this under aging. Mention it. bring the full picture to a clinical conversation. The 10th sign is unexplained weight changes, particularly weight gain around the abdomen that is resistant to diet changes. This is perhaps the most visible sign, and paradoxically, the one most often dismissed as purely a lifestyle problem. When the body becomes insulin resistant, insulin levels rise because the pancreas is compensating by producing more. And elevated insulin is one of the most potent fat storage hormones the body possesses. It signals fat cells, particularly in the abdominal region, to store rather than release. So even when a person reduces calories, exercises more, and makes changes they expect to produce results, the elevated insulin environment can stubbornly resist fat loss, especially around the belly. Helen was 68 and had been trying to lose the same 15 pounds for 2 years. She had changed her eating habits genuinely and consistently. She walked every morning. She tracked her food. Nothing moved, and the frustration was compounding because people around her seemed to lose weight more easily with similar effort, and she had started to blame her willpower and her discipline even though both were actually excellent. What Helen needed was not a stricter diet. She needed a metabolic conversation. Because if insulin is chronically elevated and the cells are resistant to its signal, fat loss becomes physiologically very difficult, regardless of how disciplined the effort is. The hormonal environment blocks what the calorie math suggests should be possible. And abdominal fat itself creates a vicious cycle. Fat tissue in the abdomen is metabolically active. It releases inflammatory signals that worsen insulin resistance, which drives more insulin production, which drives more abdominal fat storage. The cycle tightens quietly while the person blames themselves for a failure that is actually a biological process running in the wrong direction. If weight around your midsection has become resistant to genuine, sustained effort, please treat this as a clinical question rather than a personal failure. It may be telling you something specific about insulin and blood sugar that no amount of motivation can override without addressing the underlying mechanism. Now, I want to pause here and say something important before we talk about what to do with all of this. Having one of these signs is not a diagnosis. Having 2 or 3 together begins to paint a picture worth examining closely. Having 4 or 5, especially if they have developed or worsened over the same general period, is a pattern that deserves a proper blood sugar evaluation soon rather than at your next annual visit whenever that might be. The tests that matter are not complicated. A fasting blood glucose test gives a snapshot. A hemoglobin A1C test from a standard lab panel shows a 3-month average of your blood sugar levels. These are routine, inexpensive, and widely available. If your fasting glucose is consistently above 100 milligrams per deciliter or your A1C comes back above 5.7%, you are in a range called prediabetes. And prediabetes is exactly where intervention makes the most profound difference. Because at that stage, the trajectory is not fixed. It can change. I also want to be honest about what I see happen too often. People receive an A1C of 5.9 and are told to watch what they eat and come back in a year. And they do. And the number climbs. Not because they failed, but because nobody gave them a specific enough roadmap to actually reverse the direction. So let me give you a practical framework to work with right now. The first priority is blood glucose awareness. A continuous glucose monitor like the Dexterity CGM system or the Freestyle Libre 3, available at most major pharmacies with a prescription, can show you exactly how your body responds to specific foods over a 24-hour period. This is not just for people with diagnosed diabetes. It is a profoundly useful tool for anyone who suspects their blood sugar may be doing something they cannot see. The second priority is specific dietary adjustments that lower the glycemic demand on the body. This does not mean eliminating all carbohydrates. It means understanding which ones drive the largest glucose spikes for your specific metabolism. Generally, replacing refined carbohydrates with fiber-dense alternatives, adding protein and healthy fat to every meal to slow glucose absorption, and eating in a sequence where vegetables and protein come before starchy items can meaningfully reduce post-meal glucose peaks. Apple cider vinegar, specifically Bragg organic apple cider vinegar, which is widely available at Walmart, Target, and most grocery stores, has clinical evidence supporting a small but meaningful reduction in post-meal blood sugar when 1 to 2 tablespoons are diluted in water and consumed before a carbohydrate-heavy meal. It works by slowing gastric emptying and reducing the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream. The third priority is movement, and specifically the timing of movement. A 10 to 15-minute walk after meals has been shown in multiple clinical trials to reduce post-meal blood glucose more effectively than the same walk taken at a random time during the day. The muscles activated during walking act as a glucose sink, pulling sugar directly out of the bloodstream without requiring insulin. This is not a small effect. It is a meaningful and immediate intervention available to virtually everyone. The fourth priority is sleep quality, because sleep deprivation of even 2 to 3 nights can produce measurable insulin resistance in otherwise healthy adults. The body regulates glucose overnight, and disrupted sleep disrupts that regulation. If sleep is poor and multiple signs from this list are present, addressing sleep is not separate from addressing blood sugar. They are connected in a very direct physiological way. The fifth priority is a formal clinical evaluation if you have identified 3 or more of these signs in yourself during this video. A hemoglobin A1C test, a fasting insulin level, and a fasting glucose test together give a far more complete picture than any single number alone. Ask for all 3. Fasting insulin in particular is often not included in standard panels, but is highly informative about insulin resistance. It costs very little to add to a routine blood draw and can change the entire clinical picture. Let me tell you about one more person before I close, because her story brings everything together in the way I think it needs to be heard. Sandra was 70. She was not dramatically unwell. She was just, as she described it, not quite herself. She was tired more than seemed reasonable. Her feet tingled at night. She had gained about 14 pounds over 2 years without changing her eating habits significantly. Her thinking felt slightly slower than it used to. She was waking up twice a night to use the bathroom. She brought each of these things to different appointments in different months as separate complaints. The fatigue was attributed to poor sleep. The tingling was attributed to circulation. The weight was attributed to age. The bathroom trips were attributed to a smaller bladder. Nobody ever put them on the same page and looked at them together. When someone finally did, her A1C came back at 6.4, prediabetes, close to the diabetic threshold. She had likely been in a blood sugar dysregulation state for at least 3 years, based on the timeline of her symptoms. 3 years during which the nerve damage in her feet, the retinal vessel changes in her eyes, the metabolic disruption in her brain, had all been quietly accumulating. She was not in crisis. She was in the window where change is still most powerful, and she took it seriously. Within 8 months, using dietary changes, a daily post-meal walk, improved sleep hygiene, and magnesium glycinate supplementation, which she found at Costco, she brought her A1C down to 5.6, out of the prediabetes range entirely. Sandra's story is not unusual. It is actually what most people's journey with blood sugar looks like before the loud symptoms arrive. A cluster of quiet signs across different systems. A body that has been communicating clearly for longer than anyone realized. Symptoms that were real, but were never assembled into a pattern that demanded action. This is why I want you to take these 10 signs seriously, even when any single one of them feels minor. Fatigue that sleep does not fix. Vision that blurs at certain times of day. Tingling or burning in the feet or hands at night. Wounds that heal more slowly than they used to. Infections that keep returning. Hunger and cravings that arrive too soon after eating. Bathroom trips that have become more frequent, especially at night. Skin changes in the folds of your body or unusual dryness. Brain fog, word-finding difficulties, slower thinking. Abdominal weight that resists genuine effort to lose it. None of these have to be severe to be meaningful. They only have to be repeated and recognized and brought to the right conversation. Your body has been trying to tell you something. The question is not whether the message is there. The question is whether you are listening early enough to act on it before the consequences become harder to reverse than the cause. If this has described something you have been living with and dismissing, let today be the day you stop dismissing it. Get the A1C test. Request the fasting insulin level. Track the pattern. Walk after dinner. Pay attention to what your body is saying. You are not being paranoid for noticing these things. You are being exactly as careful as your health deserves. Take care of yourself.